Everyone laughed the moment Samuel Pike raised his hand for the broken church bell. It sat dumped on a flatbed trailer behind the county auction barn, cracked down one side, stained green with age, too heavy to move without a forklift, and so damaged it could never ring properly again. The auctioneer wore the smug little smile of a man enjoying someone else's humiliation. $90 from Mr. Pike, he said, for a bell that can't even do its one job. The crowd laughed louder. Not politely. Cruelly. Samuel was 73, retired, widowed, and already treated around town like a stubborn old fool who saved worthless things because he had nothing better left to hold on to. His own son looked away, ashamed to be seen beside him, while two church trustees whispered that the bell belonged in a scrapyard. Samuel did not argue. He only placed one rough hand on the cold bronze and said, "Some things don't need to ring to be heard." Nobody understood. Not then. But weeks later, when that bell was opened, the first name carved inside it made the whole town choke on its laughter. If stories about forgotten people, old promises, and things the world was too quick to throw away mean something to you, consider subscribing, because what happened next was not just about an old man, a cracked bell, or $90 spent at a county auction. It was about the names a town tried to lose, and the one man stubborn enough to hear them before they disappeared forever. The auction yard behind Millstone County's old feed barn smelled of diesel smoke, damp cardboard, and coffee burned bitter in a metal urn. By mid-morning, the useful things had already gone. A dented livestock trailer, 2 hay rakes, a row of hand tools with initials carved into the handles. People had come for bargains, not memories, and by the time the auctioneer's assistant pointed toward the flatbed trailer near the back fence, half the crowd was already thinking about lunch. That was where the bell sat. It had been hauled down from the shuttered Methodist church on County Road 18, a white clapboard building with boarded windows, a sagging steeple, and weeds pressing against the steps. The church had been closed for 9 years. The congregation had scattered. The county wanted the property cleared, and the broken bell was one more thing nobody wanted to move. It lay sideways on the trailer like something dragged out of mud. The bronze had turned dark green in patches. Rusted chains circled its wooden cradle. A crooked crack ran up from the lip, deep enough to catch shadow. The clapper was gone, leaving the hollow body strangely helpless, like a mouth without a voice. "Nobody's pretending this is pretty," the auctioneer said into the microphone. "You buy it, you move it, and if it ruins your trailer, don't call me." A few men laughed. Samuel Pike stood near the back in his faded brown coat, both hands resting on his cane. He had not come for tools. His shed was already crowded with things other people had given up on. He had come because he heard at the hardware store that the church bell was finally coming down. His son Daniel stood beside him, tense before the bidding even began. "Dad," Daniel said under his breath, "please don't." Samuel kept his eyes on the bell. The auctioneer started low. $25. Who'll give me 25 for old church bronze? No hands lifted. 10 then. Somebody give me $10 for a piece of Millstone history. Samuel raised his hand. The auctioneer paused, smiling as if Samuel had stepped onto a stage. "Well now," he said, "Mr. Pike has $10. I should have known this bell would find a man with a yard full of lost causes." The crowd laughed. Samuel had been the county joke for years. The old mechanic who kept broken pumps, cracked flywheels, rusted clocks, and tractor parts from machines nobody made anymore. If something was useless but carried a story, people expected Samuel to drag it home. Daniel looked down at the mud. A scrap buyer near the front lifted 2 fingers. The bid moved to 15. Samuel went to 20. The scrap buyer smirked and pushed again, enjoying the performance more than the prize. At $40, more heads turned. At 65, the bell had become entertainment. Harold Vance, one of the church trustees, stood beside the trailer in a pressed gray jacket too clean for the auction yard. He shook his head and called out, "Samuel, you do know that bell can't ring anymore." Samuel looked at him. "I know what it is." "No," Harold said. "You know what it was." That line landed harder than the laughter. Daniel touched his father's sleeve. "We still have the roof bill, and the clinic bill. You said the truck needs brakes." Samuel did not answer. His eyes stayed on the bell, on the broken lip, on the dark inside where dirt had gathered. $80, the auctioneer called. The scrap buyer raised his hand. Samuel raised his. 90. For a breath, the yard went quiet. Then someone whistled. $90 from Mr. Pike, the auctioneer announced, for a bell that can't even do its one job. This time the laughter came sharp. Daniel stepped back, separating himself from the bid. Miriam Cole, another trustee, pressed her clipboard against her chest. Harold looked almost relieved, as if the town's embarrassment had just become Samuel's burden. No one bid higher. Going once, going twice. Sold. Samuel walked forward alone. Up close, the bell looked worse. The crack was wider than he had realized. The bronze felt cold beneath his fingers. But near the inside lip, under dirt and old grease, he saw a faint uneven line that did not belong to the crack. It was straighter. Deliberate. Asem. The sight pulled a memory from 50 years earlier. His mother at the kitchen sink, hands red from washwater, voice low and frightened. If that bell ever comes down, Samuel, don't let them melt it. Harold stepped close. Move it by Friday. County doesn't want trouble. Samuel kept his thumb on the seam. What kind of trouble? Harold's face tightened before he recovered. Old trouble. Best left alone. That was when Samuel knew the $90 had not been foolish. Daniel was already literally. His pitifully toured his pickup. The crowd had moved on. But Samuel stayed beside the trailer, palm resting against the broken bell as gently as if it were a shoulder. For the first time that morning, he did not feel like he had bought scrap. He felt like he had kept a promise. And before he could understand why Harold feared old trouble, Samuel would have to go back to the woman who first taught him that a bell could carry more than sound, his mother. Samuel did not drive straight home after the auction. He let Daniel leave first, watching his son's pickup throw gravel at the edge of the lot and disappear onto County Road 9. Then Samuel stood beside the flatbed a little longer, his fingers still carrying the cold of the bell. He had spent $90 he did not have to spare. Daniel knew it. Everyone in the auction yard knew it. What they did not know was that Samuel Pike had spent most of his life being careful with money, careful with words, careful with grief. For 46 years, he had run Pike Repair out of a low-metal building behind his house. Farmers brought him tractors that coughed blue smoke, hay balers with bent teeth, well pumps that screamed in the night, and washing machines that shook across kitchen floors. Samuel was not fast, but he was honest. He listened to machines the way other men listened to gossip. A skip in a motor, a dry bearing, a loose chain, a faint change in pressure, those things spoke to him before they broke. His wife, Martha, used to say he trusted old metal because old metal never lied. It only showed what had been done to it. Martha had been gone 3 years now. Her coffee cup still sat on the second shelf of the kitchen cabinet, turned handle out the way she liked it. Samuel had tried moving it once, then stood in the kitchen with the cup in his hand until the room felt too large. After that, he put it back and left it there. Daniel called it unhealthy. Samuel called it knowing where something belonged. Since Martha's funeral, the house had grown quieter. The repair shop had grown quieter too. New machines came with plastic covers, sealed parts, computer codes, and service contracts from dealerships in bigger towns. Younger farmers did not always come to Samuel first anymore. They came when the new place told them the repair would cost more than the machine was worth. Daniel saw the numbers. He saw the roof patches, the clinic bill from Samuel's winter fall, the truck brakes that ground every time Samuel pulled into town. To Daniel, the workshop was not memory. It was a building full of unpaid decisions. Shelves of rust, coffee cans of bolts, motors under tarps, 3 clocks Samuel intended to fix, 2 pump housings no one had claimed. And now, apparently, a church bell too big to fit through the door. Daniel was not cruel. That made it harder. He was practical in the exhausted way of a man who had spent too long worrying about a parent who would not ask for help. But Daniel had never understood why his father kept broken things. Martha had, Eleanor Pike had too. Samuel's mother had been a small woman with strong wrists, gray eyes, and a silence people mistook for obedience. She cleaned the Methodist church on County Road 18 for nearly 30 years. Every Friday afternoon, she scrubbed the entry floor, polished the brass candle holders, beat dust from the pew cushions, and washed fingerprints off the sanctuary windows. When Samuel was a boy, she sometimes brought him with her after school. He remembered the smell of lemon oil, damp hymnals, and coal smoke trapped in the old walls. He remembered sitting in the last pew with a library book while his mother moved through the church in a faded apron, humming only when she thought no one could hear. And he remembered the bell. Back then, it still hung in the steeple. On Sunday mornings, the sound rolled over the valley, across cornfields, over the creek, and down toward the miners' houses near the old spur line. The bell rang for weddings. It rang for funerals. It rang when a child was baptized and when a storm took the power out and people came looking for one another by lantern light. But there were times Eleanor heard it and turned pale. Once, when Samuel was 12, a funeral bell tolled for a retired banker Samuel barely knew. The whole town gathered. Flowers filled the sanctuary. Men in suits stood in the aisle with hats pressed to their chests. Eleanor kept cleaning wax from a brass holder near the altar, her jaw tight, her eyes lowered. Afterward, when the church emptied, Samuel asked, "Why does the bell make you sad?" His mother looked up toward the steeple as if the bell might hear her. Then she said, "Because it remembers more than people do." That was all. Years later, when Samuel was grown and already married to Martha, Eleanor grew sick. The sickness took weight from her face and strength from her voice, but it did not take her worry. One November evening, rain tapped against the kitchen window while Samuel sat beside her bed, pretending to read the newspaper. Eleanor reached for his wrist. "If that bell ever comes down," she whispered, "don't let them melt it." Samuel thought fever had pulled her backward into old church days. "Mama, rest." Her fingers tightened with surprising force. "Listen to me. Not the plate, not what they wrote on it. The north seam." Samuel leaned closer. "What seam?" But her eyes had already filled with tears. "There are names," she said. "Names they never let us say." He asked who. He asked what she meant. She only shook her head, as if fear had outlived even the people who caused it. 3 weeks later, she was gone. Samuel kept her Bible, her thimble, a photograph of her standing outside the church in 1958, and a folded scrap of paper he found years afterward tucked into the back cover of her hymnal. North Seam. Don't trust the dedication plate. For decades, the words sat in a cigar box on a shelf above his workbench. Sometimes Samuel took the paper down and read it. Sometimes he nearly drove to the church to ask questions. But the bell remained in the steeple, high above reach, and life kept finding reasons to wait. Work, marriage, Daniel, bills, Martha's illness, Martha's funeral. Then the quiet years after. Now the bell was down. Now Harold Vance had spoken of old trouble. By sunset, the broken bell sat outside Samuel's workshop beneath the cottonwood tree. Daniel had not returned. The house windows were dark except for the kitchen, where Martha's old lamp glowed over the table. Samuel went inside, took the cigar box from the shelf, and opened it with both hands. The scrap of paper was still there. North Seam. Don't trust the dedication plate. He read the words once. Then he read them again. And for the first time since his mother died, Samuel wondered whether she had not left him a memory. Maybe she had left him instructions. By the next morning, the bell had become the newest joke on Pike Road. Samuel had managed to get it home with help from a tow driver who charged less than he should have because Martha Pike had once brought soup to his mother after surgery. Even so, it took 2 chains, a winch, and almost an hour to ease the bell off the flatbed and onto heavy oak blocks outside Samuel's workshop. There it sat beneath the cottonwood tree, tilted slightly to one side, its cracked lip facing the gravel drive. From the road, it looked worse than useless. Cars slowed. A few people stared. One boy on a bicycle stopped long enough to take a picture. By noon, Earl Benson from the next property had walked over with a coffee thermos and the expression of a man trying not to laugh too early. "Well," Earl said, looking down at the bell, "I guess if the county ever needs something big to hold rainwater, you're ready." Samuel wiped dirt from the bronze with an old towel. "Morning, Earl. You planning to fix it? Planning to understand it?" Earl chuckled. "That sounds like something a man says right before he wastes 3 weeks. Samuel did not answer. He had heard worse. Men who fixed old things learned early that most people called a thing worthless the moment they stopped understanding how it worked. Daniel arrived after lunch. He pulled into the drive, shut the truck door harder than necessary, and stood with his hands on his hips, staring at the bell as if it had insulted him personally. "You actually brought it here." Samuel looked up from the inside rim. "I bought it. That's not the same as needing to bring it home." Samuel set the towel aside. "Where else would I take it?" Daniel laughed once, without humor. "To the scrapyard, Dad, where everyone else with sense would have taken it." The words hit harder than Samuel let show. He knew Daniel was tired. Tired of worrying about bills. Tired of patched roofs and old promises. Tired of a father who answered concern with silence. But Samuel also knew something Daniel did not. He had spent the morning looking at the bell the way he used to look at engines customers said were finished. First, he did not try to repair. He observed. He measured. He listened. The crack was real, but it was not what interested him. The missing clapper did not interest him either. Those were obvious wounds. Samuel had learned long ago that the truth of a broken thing was rarely found in the loudest damage. It was found in the parts someone hoped you would not notice. The dedication plate sat on the outer waist of the bell, held by 4 brass screws that looked cleaner than the surrounding metal. It read, "Presented to Millstone Methodist Church, in gratitude and faith. 1958. Samuel touched the numbers with his thumb. The church itself had been older than that. His mother had cleaned it before 1958. He had heard the bell as a boy before that year, unless memory had fooled him. But memory, in Samuel's experience, did not usually invent sound. Daniel watched him. "What are you doing?" "Reading. That plate tells you everything. It was a church bell. Now it's broken. Samuel reached into his shirt pocket and took out Eleanor's folded scrap of paper. He did not hand it to Daniel. Not yet. He only looked at the words again. North Seam. Don't trust the dedication plate. Then he walked around the bell slowly. Because it had been placed sideways, he could see farther into the mouth than he could at the auction. Dirt clung to the inside lip. Old grease had dried into dark patches. Near the upper inner curve, where a casual glance would miss it, a thin line traveled along the bronze for nearly 8 inches. It was not natural. A cast bell had flowed to it. Even damaged, it carried the memory of how molten metal cooled into shape. This line interrupted that flow. Not like a crack, not like wear, more like a scar someone had tried to smooth down until it became invisible. Samuel went into the shop and came back with calipers, a flashlight, chalk, and a small brass hammer. Daniel groaned. "Dad, hold the light. I'm not helping you tear into a church bell. I'm not tearing into anything." "What are you doing then?" "Checking whether your grandmother was telling the truth." That stopped Daniel. Samuel regretted saying it the moment it left his mouth. Daniel's face changed. Not softer exactly, but less certain. "Grandma?" he asked. Samuel pointed to the seam. "She told me not to trust the plate." Daniel looked from his father to the bell. "When?" "Before she died." "And you're bringing this up now?" "The bell wasn't down before now." Daniel said nothing to that. Samuel marked the seam lightly with chalk. Then he tapped the bronze in 3 places with the brass hammer. The first sound was dull because of the crack. The second sound was flatter. The third, near the seam, was wrong. Not empty. Not ringing. Blocked. Samuel tapped again, softer this time. There was something inside the wall of the bell, or behind it, or sealed into it. He could not yet say what, but the sound told him the metal was not uniform. Daniel heard it too. Samuel saw it in his son's eyes before Daniel could hide it. "What was that?" Daniel asked. Samuel kept his voice even. "That's what I'm trying to find out." He moved to the dedication plate and examined the screws. They were brass, but not as old as the plate wanted to pretend. Their slots were too clean. One had tool marks from a modern screwdriver. Under the edge of the plate, he saw a trace of darker metal, as if something larger had once been covered. By late afternoon, the scrap buyer from the auction pulled into the driveway. He did not get out right away. He sat in his truck, looking at the bell, then at Samuel's workshop. Finally, he stepped down and offered Samuel a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Changed your mind yet?" "No. I'll give you 150. Saves you the trouble." Daniel looked quickly at his father. The number was small, but it was still more than Samuel had paid. Samuel shook his head. The scrap buyer's smile tightened. "Suit yourself. Just don't ruin it before you know what you've got." The sentence stayed in the air after he left. Daniel turned slowly. What did he mean by that? Samuel looked back at the chalk line inside the bell, at the plate his mother had warned him not to trust, and at the faint scar hidden beneath 50 years of dirt. "I don't know yet," he said, but that was not entirely true. He knew enough to understand one thing. The town had been wrong about the bell being empty, and if he wanted to know what had been sealed inside it, he would have to do more than clean it. He would have to open the wound without destroying the only witness left. Samuel waited until morning to touch the seam again. Not because he was patient, though people had always said he was. He waited because old metal punished haste. A man could ruin a thread, shear a bolt, crack a housing, or destroy the one clue he had simply by wanting an answer too badly. So he did what he had done with broken engines for most of his life. He cleaned first. With the bell resting on oak blocks beneath the cottonwood tree, Samuel brushed away dirt from the inner lip, wiped the grease with kerosene, and worked slowly along the faint line his chalk had marked the day before. The seam grew clearer under the grind. It was not straight all the way through. In places, it wandered slightly, as though someone had followed the curve of the bell by hand. That mattered. Factory work had confidence. Hiding work had fear. Samuel set a lamp low near the mouth of the bell, then leaned inside with a magnifying glass and a hooked dental pick he had used for carburetors. His knees complained. His back tightened. His right hand trembled once, then steadied. He found a shallow groove along the seam, almost filled with old polishing compound. Someone had worked hard to make the line disappear. He was so focused that he did not hear Daniel's truck pull in. "What are you doing now?" Daniel asked. Samuel did not look up, trying not to damage it. Daniel stepped closer and saw the tools laid out on the bench: brass hammer, small chisels, calipers, penetrating oil, cloth pads, a propane torch Samuel had not yet lit. "No," Daniel said sharply. "Absolutely not." Samuel sat back on his heels. "I haven't heated anything. You're 73 years old. crouched inside a cracked bell with a torch beside you. It isn't lit. That's not the point. Samuel removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked tired in the morning light, more tired than Daniel wanted him to look. That made Daniel angrier, not less. You fell last winter walking from the shop to the house, Daniel said. You spent 2 months pretending your hip didn't hurt. Now you're going to wrestle with a 1,000-pound church bell because Grandma wrote something on a scrap of paper? Samuel's face tightened. She didn't just write something. Then tell me what she meant. I don't know yet. That's the problem, Dad. You never know enough to stop. The words landed between them. Samuel looked toward the house, toward the kitchen window where Martha's lamp would glow after sunset. He could have told Daniel that stopping had become too easy after Martha died. Too easy to let the shop go quiet, let the roof leak, let people decide he was finished because he was old. But that was not the kind of thing a man said while holding a chisel. So Samuel only said, "Your grandmother was afraid of this bell being melted." Daniel shook his head. And maybe she was afraid because she was sick. Samuel looked back at the seam. Maybe. The answer surprised Daniel. He had expected stubbornness. What he heard was uncertainty. That frightened him more. Before either man could say more, another vehicle turned into the drive. Harold Vance stepped out first, still dressed like a man attending a meeting no one else had been invited to. Miriam Cole followed with a folder clutched against her side. Behind them came a younger man Samuel recognized from the county office. Harold's eyes went immediately to the tools. "Well," he said, "that looks concerning." Samuel stood slowly. "Morning, Harold." Miriam looked at the bell, then at the chalk marks. "Samuel, the church board has been discussing the matter. You sold it at auction." "The county sold it," Harold corrected, under the assumption it would be removed respectfully. "It has been." Harold's mouth tightened. "Taking chisels to it is not respectful." Daniel looked between them. For once, his frustration shifted toward someone other than his father. "What exactly do you want?" Daniel asked. Miriam opened the folder. "We're prepared to reimburse the $90. Samuel almost smiled. "That generous?" "And cover hauling," Harold added. "The bell can be transferred to a proper storage facility until the board decides what should happen." Samuel picked up a cloth and wiped his hands. "You didn't want it yesterday. That was before we understood you intended to alter it. I intend to understand it." Harold stepped closer, lowering his voice but not enough. "Some things are better preserved by leaving them alone." Samuel studied him. "Preserved, or hidden?" The younger county man shifted uncomfortably. Miriam's face went pale around the mouth. Harold looked at Daniel. "Your father could create legal trouble for himself." Daniel did not answer right away. Yesterday, that warning might have pushed him to pull Samuel inside and end the whole thing. But now he had heard the blocked sound in the bronze. He had seen the seam. He had heard Harold say old trouble. "What kind of legal trouble?" Daniel asked. Harold's expression cooled. "Damage to a religious artifact. Mishandling county property. There are options." Samuel looked at the receipt, lying on his workbench. "I paid for it. Ownership can be complicated." It wasn't complicated when nobody wanted it. For the first time, Harold had no quick reply. They left with their folder unopened and their warning hanging in the yard. Daniel watched their car disappear, then turned to Samuel. "You understand that made things worse." Samuel nodded. "Usually does." By late afternoon, trouble came wearing a better suit. The man introduced himself as Mr. Calloway, a private collector from Street Lewis. He drove a black sedan that looked too clean for Pike Road and wore leather gloves though the day was warm. He said he specialized in historic church fixtures, old bells, pulpit rails, stained glass, things that deserved preservation. Then he offered Samuel $5,000. Daniel went still. $5,000 would not solve everything, but it would patch the roof, fix the truck brakes, and take the sharpest edge off the clinic bill. It was also absurd. No collector paid that much for a cracked bell with a missing clapper unless he knew something. Samuel asked, "Why do you want it?" Calloway smiled. "Sentimental market. For a broken bell? Some buyers appreciate patina." Samuel looked at the man's clean gloves, then at the bell, then at the faint chalk line near the inner lip. "Do your buyers appreciate seams?" The smile faded by half an inch. Daniel saw it. Calloway recovered quickly. "I'd advise against amateur restoration. You may reduce its value." "There it is again," Samuel said. "What?" "People keep worrying I'll ruin something worthless." Calloway folded his offer sheet and placed it on the workbench anyway. "My number is there. It expires tomorrow." After he left, Daniel picked up the paper. His hand hovered over the amount. "Dad," he said quietly, "that is real money." Samuel nodded. "We need real money." "I know." Daniel looked at him, exhausted. Then why does it feel like you're about to say no? Samuel did not answer at first. He leaned back into the bell with the flashlight, following the seam farther than he had before. Near the lower curve, where grime had gathered in a crescent, he noticed 3 tiny marks scratched into the bronze. Not numbers. Letters. U. B. His breath caught. Daniel stepped closer. What is it? Samuel touched the marks with one finger, careful as prayer. My mother's initials. The yard seemed to lose sound around them. For the first time all day, Daniel did not tell his father to stop. Samuel looked at the seam, the hidden letters, and the collector's offer lying open on the bench. Then he understood the real problem. Opening the bell might cost him money he badly needed, but selling it might bury his mother's fear forever. And by morning, Samuel would have to decide which loss he could live with. Clara Whitcomb lived 3 miles outside town in a narrow brick house beside the old Foundry Road. Most people in Millstone County remembered the Foundry only as a dead building with broken windows and saplings growing through the loading dock. Samuel remembered it differently. He remembered heat trembling above the floor, men shouting over machines, molten metal moving like orange water, and Clara Whitcomb standing in the middle of it all, with leather gloves up to her elbows. She had been one of the best metalworkers the county ever had. Now she was 80, narrow as a fence rail, with silver hair pinned behind her head and hands that still looked strong enough to bend wire. When Samuel called and asked if she could look at something unusual in an old bell, she did not laugh. She only said, "Bring pictures, and don't clean it too pretty before I see what the dirt is hiding." So Samuel brought photographs, rubbings of the seam, a sketch of the dedication plate, and the small brass screw he had removed from one corner before losing his nerve. Daniel drove him, though he insisted he was only coming because his father should not be lifting anything heavy. Clara spread everything across her kitchen table. For several minutes, she said nothing. That was when Samuel knew she was taking it seriously. She adjusted her glasses, studied the photograph of the seam, then picked up the screw and rolled it between her fingers. "This screw isn't from 1958, she said. Daniel leaned forward. "How can you tell?" "Slot cut. Thread pattern. Finish." Clara set it down. "Could be from the 70s. Maybe later. Somebody removed that plate after it was installed, then put it back. Maybe more than once." Samuel felt Daniel glance at him. Clara moved to the rubbing of the seam. "This here bothers me more." "The seam?" Samuel asked. "That isn't a casting flaw." Daniel crossed his arms. "Then what is it?" Clara tapped the paper with one bent finger. "A repair? Maybe. But not the kind you make when you're trying to make a bell ring again." Samuel waited. Clara looked at him over her glasses. "If a bell cracks, you can patch it, weld it, brace it, or retire it. What you don't do is create a hidden interior line along the lip unless you are covering access to something." The kitchen seemed to grow smaller. Daniel's face changed the way it had changed when he first heard the blocked sound in the bronze. He was not convinced yet, but he was no longer comfortable dismissing it. "Access to what?" he asked. Clara gave a dry little laugh. "That's the question people get into trouble for asking." She stood slowly and went to a cabinet near the back door. From a drawer, she took out an old measuring tape, a magnet, and a small notebook with cracked black covers. "I worked on bronze repairs for 32 years, she said. "Church bells, courthouse bells, school bells, cemetery gates, war memorial plaques. Folks think metal tells only one story. It doesn't. Metal tells the story of every hand that touched it." She opened Samuel's sketch again. "This bell has been altered. Carefully. Not by amateurs. Whoever did it wanted the outside to look ordinary. The plate may have been used to redirect attention. People read words before they study metal." Samuel thought of his mother's note, "Don't trust the dedication plate." Daniel saw his father's expression. "What?" Samuel took Eleanor's scrap of paper from his wallet and placed it on Clara's table. "North seam. Don't trust the dedication plate." Clara read it twice. Then she sat down. "Who wrote this?" "My mother." "When?" "Before she died." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Outside, wind moved through the dry leaves along her porch steps. Finally, she said, "Then your mother knew something." On the drive back, Daniel did not speak for nearly 10 minutes. That was unusual. Daniel had always filled silence when he was angry. Silence now meant he was thinking. At last, he said, "Why didn't you show me that note before?" Samuel watched the road. "Because I didn't know what it was. It was Grandma's handwriting. I knew that." "Then you knew it mattered." Samuel turned the folded paper in his hands. "A thing can matter without a man understanding why." Daniel looked over, frustrated but quieter than before. "Do you understand now?" "No," Samuel said, "but I understand she wasn't confused." That evening, Daniel stayed at the workshop instead of leaving right away. He held the flashlight while Samuel examined the dedication plate again. The words looked simple enough. Presented to Millstone Methodist Church, in gratitude and faith, 1,958. But now every part of it felt staged. The plate was too neat, the screws too new, the placement too convenient. Samuel worked a thin blade under the lower edge and lifted it just enough to see beneath. There was darker bronze under the plate, and beneath that, partly hidden, a rougher patch where another plate or inscription might once have been removed. Daniel exhaled slowly. Someone covered something. Samuel lowered the blade. Looks that way. Could still be nothing. Samuel nodded. Could be. But Daniel did not sound like he believed that anymore. The next morning, they went to the Millstone Public Library. Ruth Ann Mercer, the librarian, had known Samuel since Daniel was in grade school. She wore reading glasses on a chain and had the firm patience of someone who had spent 30 years helping people find things they were certain did not exist. When Samuel asked about the church bell, she brought out a local history binder. When he asked about 1,958, she found photographs of a rededication ceremony at the Methodist Church. There was the bell, polished and hanging lower than it had in Samuel's childhood memory. There were church leaders smiling beneath it. There was Harold Vance's grandfather standing near the front row. But none of the photographs showed the bell before the ceremony. Try before 1958, Samuel said. Ruth Ann's eyebrows rose. How far before? Samuel hesitated. Then he said, try 1,949. He did not know why that year came to him. Maybe from a half-remembered conversation. Maybe from the photograph of his mother in the cigar box. Maybe because fear had its own calendar. Ruth Ann disappeared into the microfilm room. Daniel sat beside Samuel at a long wooden table, looking uncomfortable among the quiet shelves. Dad, he said, if this turns into something ugly, it was ugly before we found it. Daniel did not answer. Ruth Ann returned 20 minutes later with a printed copy of an old newspaper page. The headline was faded but readable. Minor incident reported at North Ridge. Mine? Samuel read the article once. Then again. The report said there had been a collapse in one of the service tunnels. It said several workers were treated for injuries. It said no confirmed fatalities had been reported. It said the matter was under review by the company and county officials. But at the bottom of the article, where witnesses were mentioned, 3 lines had been badly blurred in the archive scan. Ruth Ann laid another page beside it. This is strange, she said. The next issue should have the follow-up. It's missing from the bound volume. Daniel looked at her. Missing how? As in, cut out. Samuel stared at the headline. Northridge Mine. He knew that name, not well. But enough. It was the old mine beyond the creek road, sealed before he was born old enough to ask questions. His mother had once stopped the car near that road and told him never to play there. Ruth Ann lowered her voice. Samuel, there's something else. She turned the 1,958 rededication photograph around and pointed to the edge of the frame. There, half hidden behind the church steps, stood Eleanor Pike. She was younger, thinner, her hands clasped in front of her, and she was looking not at the camera, not at the pastor, not at the church board. She was looking up at the bell. The room went still. Samuel touched the photograph with one finger. For the first time, Daniel did not ask whether this was worth the trouble. He only said, "What do we do now?" Samuel folded the newspaper copy and placed it beside his mother's note. We asked Clara how to open the seam without breaking what's inside. And that was how the broken bell stopped being an embarrassment. It became evidence. Clara Whitcomb came to Samuel's workshop the next morning with a canvas tool roll, a portable work light, and the kind of silence that made both Samuel and Daniel stop talking. She did not greet the bell like an object. She walked around it once, slowly, studying the crack, the chalk marks, the dedication plate, and the faint line near the inner lip. Then she crouched with effort, ran one finger along the seam, and exhaled through her nose. Well, she said, somebody did not want this found by accident. Daniel stood beside the workbench with his arms folded, but not as tightly as before. He had come early. Samuel had found him in the yard before sunrise, unloading extension cords from the truck, and pretending he had only stopped by to make sure his father did not hurt himself. Samuel had not thanked him. Daniel had not asked for thanks. That was the closest they had come to peace in weeks. Clara opened her tool roll. Inside were small chisels, brass wedges, a hand torch, heat cloth, a jeweler's saw, and narrow picks shaped like dental tools. She lifted each one with care and placed them in order on Samuel's bench. We are not cutting deep, she said. We are not forcing anything. We are going to test the old solder, soften what can be softened, and lift only what is already trying to separate. Daniel looked at the bell. And if it cracks worse, then we stop. Samuel nodded. Clara glanced at him. I mean that, Samuel. I heard you. No. You listened. There's a difference. The words sounded so much like something Martha might have said that Samuel looked away. They began with the dedication plate. Clara did not remove it fully. She loosened the screws just enough to slide a thin strip of paper beneath the lower edge. The paper came out stained with dark residue, almost black. Old oxidation, Clara said, and something else. She held it to the light. There were tiny flakes stuck to the paper. Not dirt, not rust. A darker green than the surrounding bronze. Different alloy, she murmured. Samuel felt the old mechanic's part of his mind wake fully. Different alloy meant different work. Different time. Different hand. Clara moved to the inner seam. She warmed the area slowly, never letting the flame stay in one place. Daniel held the light. Samuel steadied a folded heat cloth beneath the lip. The bell did not ring, but it seemed to answer the heat in small ticks and sighs, old metal shifting after decades of silence. Easy, Clara said. She pressed a brass wedge against the seam and tapped once. Nothing. She tapped again. A faint line of gray dust loosened. Daniel swallowed. Is that bad? That, Clara said, is old filler giving up. For nearly an hour, they worked in inches. Heat, tap, wait. Heat, tap, wait. The morning warmed around them. A truck passed on Pike Road, and slowed but did not stop. Somewhere beyond the trees, a dog barked twice and went quiet. Inside the workshop, Samuel's wall clock ticked too loudly. At one point, Samuel's hand cramped around the heat cloth. Daniel noticed before Samuel said anything. Switch with me, Daniel said. I'm fine. Dad. Samuel looked at him. Daniel held out his hand. Switch with me. Samuel almost refused out of habit. Then he stepped back and let his son take the cloth. Clara saw the exchange but said nothing. The next tap changed everything. It was small. No dramatic crack. No burst of hidden light. Just a thin piece of bronze-colored filler lifting away from the seam like a scab from an old wound. Clara froze. Samuel stopped breathing. Daniel whispered, Is that it? Clara did not answer. She took tweezers from the roll and lifted the loosened strip free. Beneath it was a narrow, shadowed groove. Not deep, but deliberate. And inside the groove, partly hidden by residue, were scratches. At first Samuel thought they were tool marks. Then Clara adjusted the light. The scratches had shape. Letters? Not clean engraved letters. Not factory work. These were cramped, uneven, cut by hand with something sharp and hurried. Samuel leaned closer until Daniel caught his elbow. Careful. Samuel barely heard him. Clara brushed the groove with a dry sable brush. A little more residue fell away. The first mark became an M. Then, a period. Then a space. Then a name. Monsieur Alvarez. No one spoke. Clara moved the brush farther along the groove. More letters appeared, broken by corrosion and age. T. Booker. Then another. J. Hanley. Daniel took one step back from the bell as if the names had pushed him. Samuel's throat tightened so suddenly he had to look down. For 50 years, his mother's words had lived in him like a strange family superstition. There are names. Names they never let us say. He had carried the sentence without understanding its weight. Now 3 of those names lay in front of him, scratched into bronze where no ordinary eye would ever find them. Daniel's voice came out rough. Those are people. Clara nodded slowly. Yes. Not donors? No. Pastors? No. Samuel touched the outside of the bell, not the letters. He did not trust himself to touch the letters. My mother knew, he said. Clara's face softened, but only for a moment. Looks like she did more than know. They did not continue immediately. Clara insisted on documenting everything before removing another inch of filler. Daniel took photographs from several angles. Samuel wrote the time, date, and location in one of his old repair notebooks because that was what he had always done when a machine revealed its first honest symptom. But this was no machine. This was testimony. By noon, Ruth Ann Mercer arrived from the library carrying a folder against her chest. Daniel had called her after the first name appeared. She walked into the yard with quick, careful steps, as if afraid she might arrive too late and the past would close itself again. Samuel showed her the photographs. Ruth Ann read the names silently. Then she opened her folder. I searched every public memorial list connected to Millstone Methodist, she said. War memorials, church donor plaques, cemetery records, baptismal rolls, funeral ledgers. And, Daniel asked, these 3 names do not appear where they should. Samuel waited. Ruth Ann removed the newspaper page from 1949 and placed it on the workbench. Minor incident reported at Northridge Mine. She had underlined the article in pencil. I checked the Northridge Mine file again, she said. The official county summary says no confirmed fatalities. Daniel looked at the bell, then at the paper. But if these names were hidden inside a church bell, then someone believed there were dead worth naming, Ruth Ann said. The sentence settled over the yard. Samuel stared at the first name in the photograph, Monsieur Alvarez. He tried to imagine the hand that carved it. Afraid, rushed, determined. Someone had known that paper could be burned, ledgers could be removed, newspaper pages could be cut from bound volumes. But bronze, if hidden well enough, might outlast everyone. Clara packed the loosened strip of filler into a small envelope. "We stop here for today," she said. Samuel looked at her. "There are more." "I know." "Then we keep going." "No." Clara's voice sharpened. "Now this becomes bigger than your workshop. If there are names inside that bell, and if those names connect to North Ridge, people are going to care who controls the evidence." Daniel looked toward the road. A car had slowed near the mailbox. For a moment, all four of them watched it roll past. Then Ruth Ann said what no one else wanted to say. "If Harold Vance hears about this, he'll come for the bell." Samuel folded his repair notebook closed. "He already came once." Clara looked at him. "Next time, he won't come with a reimbursement check." Samuel glanced at Daniel, expecting fear, anger, maybe even regret. But Daniel was looking at the bell. Not like Yunk, not like a burden, like a witness. "What do we do?" Daniel asked. Samuel looked again at the three names, then at the hidden seam still waiting beneath the old filler. "We make copies of everything," he said, "and then we find out how many more they buried in there." By the next morning, the bell was no longer Samuel Pike's private mistake. It was the thing people whispered about at the diner before their eggs went cold. It was the subject of quiet calls from the church office. It was the reason 2 trucks slowed in front of Samuel's house before breakfast and kept rolling when Daniel stepped onto the porch. Nobody knew the whole story. That did not stop them from choosing sides. Some said Samuel had carved the names himself for attention. Some said Ruth Ann Mercer had gone digging through old records because librarians love trouble. Some said the Methodist Church had no business, being dragged through county gossip over 3 scratched names and a broken bell. But others heard the names differently. Monsieur Alvarez, T. Booker, J. Hanley. Old names had a way of finding old wounds. By 10 o'clock, Harold Vance was back in Samuel's yard, and this time he did not come alone. Miriam Cole was with him again, along with the county clerk, a sheriff's deputy, and a thin man in a navy blazer who introduced himself as legal counsel for the church board. Daniel stood beside Samuel near the workshop door. That alone changed the air. Harold noticed it too. "Samuel," Harold said, "this has gotten out of hand." Samuel looked at the group gathered around the bell. "It got out of hand before I was born." The lawyer stepped forward. "Mr. Pike, we are not here to argue history. We are here to prevent damage to a religious artifact with possible historical significance." Clara Whitcomb, who had returned after breakfast, gave a dry laugh from beside the workbench. It became historically significant the moment he found what somebody hid inside it. The lawyer ignored her. "The church board believes the bell should be transferred to a neutral facility while ownership and preservation protocols are reviewed." Samuel looked at Harold. "Neutral?" Harold's jaw tightened. "Safe." Ruth Ann arrived just then, carrying a folder and breathing hard from the walk across the gravel. "If it leaves this property before the markings are fully documented, the evidence could disappear." The deputy shifted uncomfortably. "Nobody's accusing anyone of anything." "No," Ruth Ann said. "That is usually how things disappear." Miriam Cole looked genuinely shaken. She was not like Harold. Samuel could see that now. Miriam had come to protect the church's reputation, but the names had frightened her in a way reputation could not explain. Harold held out a paper. "This is a formal request that you cease all work on the bell for 48 hours. Daniel took one step forward. "Request or order?" the lawyer answered. "A request pending review. Then he doesn't have to agree." Samuel turned slightly toward his son. Daniel kept his eyes on the lawyer, but his face was pale. Standing with Samuel was costing him something. Not money yet. Something harder for Daniel. Certainty. Harold saw the opening. "Daniel," he said, softening his voice, "I know this is difficult. Your father has been under strain. No one wants him hurt, financially or otherwise." Daniel's mouth tightened. Samuel felt the words before his son answered. Under strain. It was a polite way to say old. Confused. Grieving. Not fully reliable. Daniel looked at Harold. "Don't talk about him like he isn't standing here." For a moment, Samuel forgot the bell. The yard went quiet. Then a black sedan turned into the drive. Mr. Calloway stepped out wearing the same leather gloves, though the morning was already warm. He looked at the people in the yard as if he had expected them. "I seem to have arrived at a busy time," he said. "No one invited you," Clara said. Calloway smiled. "Mr. Pike has my offer. It expired, Samuel said. I reconsidered. Calloway reached into his coat and removed a folded document. $25,000. Paid today. I take full responsibility for transportation, preservation, and private restoration. Daniel stared at him. $25,000 did what 5,000 had not. It changed the weight of the air. Samuel knew the math because Daniel knew the math. Roof, clinic bill, truck brakes, property taxes, heating oil before winter. $25,000 would not make Samuel rich, but it would stop several things from collapsing at once. Harold's face changed when he heard the number. Not surprise, fear. That told Samuel more than the offer itself. Daniel lowered his voice. Dad. Samuel did not look at him. I know. No, you don't. Daniel's voice cracked slightly. You keep saying you know, but you don't know what it's like to watch you choose every broken thing in this county and wonder if there's going to be anything left when you actually need help. Samuel looked down. The words hurt because they were not entirely wrong. Daniel swallowed. I believe something is in there now. I do, but I also know Grandma is gone. Mom is gone, and you're still here. Calloway let the silence stretch, then placed the offer on the workbench. Some truths, he said, are better preserved quietly. Clara turned on him. That sentence is usually spoken by people buying silence. Before anyone could answer, a small blue car pulled up behind the deputy's vehicle. An elderly woman stepped out slowly, gripping the doorframe before she trusted her knees. She wore a faded green coat though the day was mild, and her white hair was pinned neatly beneath a scarf. Ruth Ann recognized her first. Mrs. Alvarez? The woman looked toward the bell. I heard, she said. No one moved. Her name was Teresa Alvarez. Samuel remembered seeing her at the pharmacy, at the post office, once at Martha's funeral. She was the kind of woman people described as sweet because they had never asked what she survived. Ruth Ann walked to her. You didn't have to come. Teresa kept her eyes on the bell. My grandfather's name was Mateo Alvarez. Samuel felt the yard shift. Monsieur Alvarez. Teresa came closer, each step careful. My mother said he left one morning for North Ridge and never came home. The company told my grandmother he ran off after causing trouble. No body, no wages, no pension. Just a story that made his children ashamed to ask questions. Harold looked away. Teresa saw it. You know that name? She asked him. Harold said nothing. Teresa turned to Samuel. Is it really inside? Samuel nodded. Only the first initial so far. M. Alvarez. The old woman closed her eyes. For a long time, no one spoke. Then she opened them and said, My mother died thinking her father abandoned her. That was the moment the bell stopped being evidence in the abstract. It became a family standing in the yard. Daniel looked at the offer sheet on the bench. $25,000. Then he looked at Teresa Alvarez, who had waited nearly her whole life for one initial carved in hidden bronze. He picked up Calloway's offer. For one terrible second, Samuel thought his son was going to tell him to take it. Instead, Daniel folded the paper once, then again, and handed it back to Calloway. My father said no. Calloway's smile vanished. Harold stepped forward. Daniel, you may regret that. Daniel looked at him. I already regret enough. The lawyer gathered his papers. This is not over. Samuel watched them leave, one by one, except Teresa, Ruth Ann, Clara, and Daniel. The yard felt larger after the cars pulled away. Teresa stood beside the bell but did not touch it. Are there more names? She asked. Samuel looked at the seam, still mostly sealed, still holding back whatever Eleanor Pike had helped protect. Yes, he said. I think there are. Then don't stop with my grandfather. Samuel nodded. That night, Daniel stayed. Together, father and son moved the work lights closer, covered the bell against the damp, and locked the workshop gate for the first time in years. Samuel placed Eleanor's note, the photographs, the newspaper article, and the first 3 names in separate envelopes. Then he looked at Daniel. Tomorrow, Samuel said, we open the rest. Daniel nodded, though fear sat plain on his face, because both men understood now. Once the full truth came out, it would not only expose what had been hidden in the bell, it would expose who had needed it hidden. The next morning, Samuel opened the workshop before sunrise. He had not slept much. Neither had Daniel. They moved, gone, each other in the gray light without needing many words, setting up work lamps, laying clean cloths on the bench, checking the camera batteries, and placing Eleanor's note inside a plastic sleeve Ruth Ann had brought from the library. Clara arrived with stronger tools and a stricter face. If we do this, she said, we document every inch before we touch it. Samuel nodded. Ruth Ann set up her camera. Daniel positioned the lights. Teresa Alvarez sat in a folding chair near the cottonwood tree, wrapped in her green coat, hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles looked white. She had asked to be there. Samuel had almost said no. Then he realized she had waited longer than anyone. Clara began where they had stopped the day before. Heat, brush, wedge, pause, photograph, note. Then again, the old filler lifted slowly, not in one clean strip, but in stubborn pieces that clung to the bronze as if still protecting what lay beneath. No one rushed her. Every few inches, more letters appeared. Not all at once. A surname first, then an initial, then another mark. Some names were easier to read than others. Some were cramped near the curve, cut by a hand that must have been tired or frightened. Others were deeper, almost angry, as if the carver had pressed the tool hard enough to make the bronze remember. By noon, they had uncovered 9 names. By 2 o'clock, 17. By late afternoon, Clara removed the final section of old filler from the inner lip of the bell. 27 names circled the hidden seam. Samuel wrote each one in his repair notebook, though his hand shook badly enough that Daniel finally took the pen from him and continued. Mateo Alvarez, Thomas Booker, James Hanley, Eli Ward, Samuel Price, Caleb Freeman, Jonas Bell, Peter Novak, Luis Ortega, Henry Cobb, and 17 more. Some names Ruth Ann recognized from old census pages. Some had no grave marker in Millstone County. Some had families who had moved away after 1949 with nothing but rumor and shame following them. Teresa Alvarez did not cry when Mateo's full name appeared. She only leaned forward, as if listening to someone speaking from very far away. My grandmother said he never would have left without his lunch pail, she whispered. No one knew what to say to that. Then Clara found the second chamber. It was near the crown of the bell, hidden behind a small plug of metal so carefully blended into the surface that none of them had noticed it before. The seam around it was thin as a hair. If Clara had not been brushing away residue from the final name, she might have missed the slight change in texture. This is newer than the rest, she said. Samuel's mouth went dry. Newer than 1,949? Maybe not newer than 1,958. The year moved through the workshop like a cold draft. Clara worked for another 40 minutes before the plug loosened. Behind it was a narrow, hollow space, just large enough to hold something rolled tight and sealed in waxed cloth. Daniel photographed it before anyone touched it. Then Clara lifted the bundle out with tweezers and laid it on the clean cloth. The waxed fabric had darkened with age. Ruth Ann put on cotton gloves and unwrapped it slowly, while everyone else stood back as if the paper inside might crumble under the weight of their breathing. There were 2 pages. The handwriting was old, uneven, but readable. At the top was a name, Deacon Walter Hensley. Ruth Ann covered her mouth with one gloved hand. Miriam Cole had mentioned Hensley once in a church history booklet. He had been a respected deacon, a bookkeeper for the church, and part-time clerk for Northridge Mining Company. Samuel looked at Daniel. Daniel looked sick. Ruth Ann began to read aloud. The confession was not long. That made it worse. It said the Northridge collapse on the 11th of October 1949 had killed 27 men in a service tunnel the company had no legal permit to operate. It said the company ordered the tunnel sealed before all the bodies were recovered because another collapse would expose unsafe timbering, false inspection records, and unpaid insurance. It said several widows and families were told their husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons had either abandoned work, left town, or been dismissed before the incident. It said cash payments were made quietly to a few families with influence. It said other families received nothing. No funeral. No wage settlement. No death certificate. No name on the memorial. The confession named 3 men who helped bury the truth: a Northridge superintendent, a county official, and a church elder whose family still sat on the board decades later. Harold Vance's grandfather. Daniel stepped away from the bench and put both hands on the back of a chair. Teresa Alvarez finally began to cry, but quietly, without covering her face. Ruth Ann's voice trembled as she reached the last paragraph. I write these names because I helped remove them. I told myself I was protecting the church from scandal and the town from unrest. That was cowardice dressed as duty. If this paper is ever found, know that Eleanor Pike begged us to tell the families the truth. When we refused, she helped me place the names where fire, water, and shame could not reach them. She said a bell that had called the town to worship could also carry judgment until the town learned how to listen. Samuel closed his eyes. For 50 years, he had remembered his mother as a frightened woman at a kitchen sink, a woman who lowered her voice, a woman who told him not to ask questions. But she had not been only frightened. She had been brave in the only way available to her. She had not had money. She had not had office. She had not had a title, a lawyer, or a room full of men willing to listen, so she had done what she could. She had helped hide the truth in the one object the town still respected enough not to destroy. The bell. Daniel looked at his father. "I'm sorry," he said. Samuel shook his head. "Not yet." Daniel frowned. "What?" Samuel looked at the 27 names, then at the confession, then at Calloway's offer still sitting folded on the far corner of the workbench. An apology between father and son mattered, but it was not the apology the dead had waited for. By evening, copies of the confession had been made. Ruth Ann scanned every page. Daniel photographed every name. Clara sealed the removed filler, the plug, and the cloth wrapping in labeled envelopes. Teresa Alvarez called her daughter, then her cousin, then someone in Ohio who carried the Alvarez name and had grown up believing Mateo had run away. Samuel sat at the workbench while the others worked. Eleanor's note in front of him. North Seam, don't trust the dedication plate. For decades, he had thought the note was a warning. Now he understood it was an inheritance. Not money. Responsibility. At 6 o'clock, Harold Vance arrived again. He came without the lawyer this time. One look at his face told Samuel that someone had called him. Maybe the county clerk. Maybe Calloway. Maybe fear itself had finally become faster than rumor. Harold stood at the edge of the workshop, staring at the papers on the bench. "What have you done?" he asked. Samuel rose slowly. "What your grandfather should have done." Harold's face turned gray. Daniel stepped beside Samuel, but Samuel lifted one hand slightly. This part was his. Ruth Ann handed Harold a copy of the confession. Harold read the first page, then the second. His eyes stopped on his grandfather's name. For a moment, the man who had warned Samuel about old trouble looked much older than he had the day before. "This will ruin families," Harold said. Teresa Alvarez stood from her chair. It already did. Harold could not answer her. Samuel picked up the list of 27 names. His hand no longer shook. "We're taking this to the church board tonight," he said. Harold looked at the bell. "Samuel, think carefully." "I have. You can't control what happens once this becomes public." "No," Samuel said. "But I can stop helping keep it private." Harold lowered the confession slowly. The broken bell sat behind them in the workshop light, cracked and silent, no longer looking like scrap, no longer looking dead. Samuel touched the paper with the names. "This bell doesn't belong to me," he said. "It belongs to the names inside it." And that night, for the first time in 77 years, the truth left the bronze. The church had not held a real service in 9 years. But that night, every pew was full. People stood along the back wall, in the side aisle, even outside on the steps beneath the leaning steeple. Some came because they had heard about the bell. Some came because they had heard Harold Vance's grandfather named in a confession. Some came because a story their family had carried for decades had suddenly cracked open. Samuel sat in the front pew with Daniel on one side and Teresa Alvarez on the other. The broken bell was not in the sanctuary yet. It remained at the workshop, documented and guarded by Clara's careful labels and Daniel's locked gate. But its absence somehow made it feel larger. Everyone in that room knew why they were there. Ruth Ann Mercer stood at the lectern with the confession in a folder. Her voice was steady when she began. Not loud, not dramatic, just clear enough that no one could pretend not to hear. She explained the North Ridge collapse. She explained the official record. She explained the hidden seam, the false dedication plate, and the 27 names found inside the bell. When she reached the confession, the room changed. People who had come for scandal found themselves sitting inside grief. Ruth Ann did not read every ugly detail at once. She read enough. Enough to show that men had died. Enough to show that families had been lied to. Enough to show that the silence had not been an accident. Then she unfolded the list. Samuel looked down at his hands. He had fixed machines all his life, but there were some broken things no wrench could repair. A town's memory was one of them. A family's shame was another. Ruth Ann read the first name, Mateo Alvarez. Teresa bowed her head. No one moved. Thomas Booker. A man in the third row covered his mouth. James Hanley, an older woman near the aisle, whispered, "My mother knew that name." The list continued. Name after name entered the sanctuary like people coming home late from work, carrying dust on their boots and silence in their pockets. Some names belonged to families still in Millstone County. Some belonged to families long gone. Some had no one present to claim them, which somehow made the room ache more. By the time Ruth Ann finished, no one applauded. Applause would have been too easy. The silence that followed was heavier and more honest. Then Daniel stood. Samuel looked up, startled. Daniel did not walk to the lectern. He turned toward his father right there in the front pew, in front of the town that had laughed 2 weeks earlier. "I need to say something," Daniel said. His voice was rough. "I thought my father bought that bell because he couldn't let go of broken things. I thought he was wasting money we didn't have. I thought grief had made him stubborn. He paused. Samuel looked down again, but Daniel kept going. I was wrong. The words were simple. That was why they hurt. Daniel turned slightly so the room could hear him. He was keeping a promise none of us understood. And yesterday, when money was put on the table, I almost wanted him to take it. I need to say that too. Because there are families in this room who lost more than money. They lost the truth about people they loved. He looked at Teresa. I'm sorry. Teresa nodded once. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement. Sometimes that was the first honest step. Then Harold Vance stood. The room stiffened. He looked smaller than he had at the auction yard. His gray jacket was gone. His tie was loosened. In his hand was a cardboard archive box from the church office. For a moment, he seemed unable to speak. My grandfather's name is in that confession, Harold said finally. No one needed to be told that. I grew up hearing he was a good man, a strict man, a church man. I still believe there was good in him, but good in a man does not erase the harm he helped hide. His voice broke on the last word. Miriam Cole wiped at her eyes. Harold placed the box on the front communion table. These are church board minutes from 1949 through 1959, donation ledgers, burial fund notes, correspondence. I do not know what is in all of them. I should have looked before now. He turned toward Samuel. When you ask what kind of trouble, I knew enough to be afraid. I did not know enough to be honest. Samuel did not answer right away. Everyone waited for him to condemn Harold. Maybe part of the room wanted that. A clean villain would have made the story easier. But Samuel thought of Eleanor. He thought of a young woman with no power, begging men to tell the truth. He thought of Walter Hensley writing a confession because cowardice had finally become heavier than fear. At last, Samuel said, "Then be honest now." Harold nodded. "I will." That was not enough to fix 77 years, but it was enough to begin. Over the next hour, things shifted from confession to responsibility. Ruth Ann asked permission to scan every church archive page. Miriam moved that the board cooperate fully. No one objected. The county clerk, pale and quiet near the back, agreed to open the Northridge file for public review. A retired attorney offered to help descendants petition for corrected death records. Teresa Alvarez spoke last. My grandmother died ashamed, she said, not because she did anything wrong, because someone told her the man she loved had walked away. I cannot give her this truth now, but I can carry it to her grave. That was when the room finally broke, not into noise, into people. A woman crossed the aisle and sat beside Teresa. A man came forward and asked Ruth Ann if Booker might be connected to his mother's side. Someone else remembered a Hanley family buried in an unmarked section near the old cemetery road. The dead were not only names anymore. They had begun to pull the living back together. After the meeting, Daniel helped Samuel down the church steps. The night air smelled of wet grass and old wood. For a while, father and son stood under the steeple without speaking. Then Daniel said, "I should have believed you sooner." Samuel looked toward the dark shape of the bell tower where the broken bell had once hung. "I didn't understand it sooner. That's not the same thing." "No," Samuel said, "but it's close enough to forgive." Daniel's eyes filled, but he nodded. Across the yard, Harold Vance stood alone beside the archive box, waiting while Ruth Ann loaded it carefully into her car. Teresa Alvarez sat in the passenger seat, holding a copy of her grandfather's name in both hands. Samuel watched them. The truth had not healed everything. Not yet. But it had moved. And after 77 years of being sealed inside bronze, that was no small thing. The next morning, the church board voted to bring the broken bell home not as decoration, and not as proof of their goodness, as evidence, and as a promise that the names inside it would never again have to hide. By spring, the old Methodist church no longer looked abandoned. It did not look new. No one wanted that. The boards were still weathered. The steeple still leaned slightly to the east. The front steps still creaked under weight, and the white paint held more memory than shine. But the poison ivy had been cut back. The broken windows had been repaired. The weeds around the foundation had been cleared by volunteers who came on Saturdays with gloves, rakes, coffee, and quiet purpose. No one called it a restoration. They called it a return. The bell was not put back in the steeple. Clara Whitcomb said the metal was too fragile for that, and no one argued with her. Instead, a black steel frame was built beside the church steps, low enough for children to see, strong enough to hold the weight, simple enough not to distract from what mattered. The bell hung there now, cracked side facing outward. Samuel had insisted on that. Miriam Cole had asked whether the crack should face the church instead, where photographs would look cleaner. Samuel shook his head. "Let people see what happened to it," he said. So they did. The old bronze had been cleaned, but not polished bright. The seam remained visible, The hidden names had been carefully protected under a clear covering shaped to the curve of the inner lip. Beneath the bell stood a bronze plaque. Not large, not dramatic, just honest. In memory of the 27 workers of North Ridge Mine. The 11th of October, 1949. Hidden by fear, preserved by courage, returned by truth. Below that were the names. All 27. Mateo Alvarez stood first, not because he mattered more, but because his was the first name the bell had given back. Ruth Ann Mercer spent most of that spring inside the church office, scanning records page by page. Burial fund notes, board minutes, old letters, company receipts, handwritten corrections and margins that no one had thought to examine before. The missing 3 pages from the county file never reappeared, but other documents did enough talking. Death records were amended slowly, not perfectly. Government did not move at the speed of grief. But one by one, families received papers that said what their grandmothers and great-grandmothers had deserved to hear in 1949. These men had not run away, had not abandoned their children, had not disappeared because they were ashamed. They had died at work, and someone had lied. Harold Vance came to the church almost every Saturday. At first, people watched him with suspicion. Some still did. That was fair. Redemption, Samuel believed, did not erase the need for memory. But Harold showed up anyway. He carried boxes. He wrote checks for archive preservation. He contacted descendants. He sat across from Teresa Alvarez one afternoon and listened while she told him about the grandmother who waited on a porch for a man who never came home. He did not defend his grandfather. He did not ask to be forgiven. That helped. Daniel came too, not every Saturday at first, then more often. He repaired the church steps, replaced 2 rotted porch posts, and used his pickup to haul gravel for the new path from the parking area to the bell frame. He and Samuel worked side by side with the awkward care of 2 men who had said too little for too long and were trying not to break the silence too quickly. One morning, Daniel found Samuel tightening a bolt on the bell frame, even though it was already tight. "You know that bolt's not going anywhere," Daniel said. Samuel kept the wrench in place. "I know. Then why are you tightening it?" Samuel looked at him. "Gives my hands something to do." Daniel nodded, then picked up another wrench and checked the opposite side. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Then Daniel said, "I used to think you kept broken things because you couldn't let go." Samuel did not answer. Daniel tightened the bolt once, gently. "I think maybe you kept them because someone needed to stay long enough to listen." Samuel looked at his son. The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves beyond the churchyard. "That sounds like something your mother would have said," Samuel murmured. Daniel smiled sadly. "Maybe I'm finally old enough to hear her." That was as close as they came to a perfect apology. It was enough. On the day the memorial opened, the town gathered again in the churchyard. This time, there was no auctioneer, no microphone joke, no laughter at Samuel's expense. Children stood near the bell while their teacher explained why the crack had been left visible. Older people stood with folded programs. Families from 3 states came with photographs, letters, and names that had survived in kitchens and shoeboxes even when the county record failed them. Teresa Alvarez brought a lunch pail. It had belonged to her grandfather. Rust had eaten one corner, and the handle had been replaced with wire, but she carried it with both hands as if it were something holy. She placed it beneath Mateo's name and stood there for a long time. Samuel stood at the edge of the crowd with Daniel beside him. He thought of Samuel Pike cleaning the church in silence. He thought of her hands red from wash water. He thought of the fear in her voice and the courage hidden underneath it. For most of his life, Samuel had believed his mother left him a warning. Now he knew better. She had left him work. A child near the bell asked whether it still rang. The teacher looked toward Samuel, unsure how to answer. Samuel stepped forward. "Not the way it used to," he said. The child looked disappointed. Samuel smiled a little. "But that doesn't mean it's silent." He reached up and touched the cracked bronze with 2 fingers. The bell did not swing. It did not thunder across the valley. It did not call people to worship the way it once had. But a small sound moved through it. Thin, imperfect, almost too quiet. Still, everyone close enough heard it. Teresa Alvarez closed her eyes. Daniel lowered his head. Harold Vance stood near the back, hands clasped, listening like a man who understood that silence could be a sentence. Samuel stepped away from the bell. No one clapped. They did not need to. The names were there now. The records were open. The story had left the bronze and entered the town's keeping. The bell had been called junk once. Samuel never corrected them. He simply kept it long enough for the truth to ring.